Well, it is time to get started today, so glad you guys are here on this snowy morning. Glad you made it safely here. Hopefully some others are making their way here and they can be safe as well. But we will be in 2 Samuel chapter 9 this morning, so if you want to be turning to 2 Samuel chapter 9, that's where we'll be. That'll be a benefit to having it open on your lap. I'll try to have the text on the screen or on the wall up here, but it is good to have it open. As we get started, what are we thankful for? Any good news today? I know in the bulletin a lot of times there's bad news, people sick and that kind of thing, and that's good to note, but yeah.
Another day.
Thankful to live another day. Okay, me too. Glad to have safe travels over here in the snow and ice this morning. Ruth?
No cars right behind me. A nice leisurely drive.
Nice leisurely drive this morning. No cars right behind you. The Beltline was wide open at 5:30 this morning. Yeah.
So this week, I think it was like Thursday this week. Later, like loosely Popeye's chicken is packed on the east side.
Yep.
I just went there. Barely any people. Thursday.
So that is
like 3 or 4.
That is the benefit. Lower lines, and we can get through lines quicker this time of year with the cold that we're having. So before we jump into our text, let's go to God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for giving us a night of rest and for allowing us to be here this morning. Be with those who are still on their way for this class and for the second service. We're thankful for our many blessings and the many good things that we have to be thankful for. We come to you in the name of Jesus, your Son. Amen. All right, in our textbook, we're ready for lesson 11, which is on page 92, and the title they have given to this chapter is David and Mephibosheth. David and Mephibosheth. And thankfully, unlike last week, this seems to be a pretty good description of what's in this chapter. Remember, last week it was David and Michal when it was really about David and Uzzah. But this is a good summary here. So David and Mephibosheth in 2 Samuel chapter 9. I looked in my records, and it seems that we studied this passage in sermon form back on July 10th, 2011. So it's been a little while since we've studied that in sermon form. Then we also studied this passage in our Wednesday evening class on March 11th, 2015. So not quite as long as since we studied it in a Bible class, but hopefully it's a bit of a review for, I think, most of us. We should be a little bit familiar with what's in this chapter anyway. But it may be new for others. So either way, it's an interesting passage, and it's a great honor to be able to study it together this morning. So this is the inspired word of God. This came to us from God himself, and then we have this account, therefore, for a reason. And it's the account of David reconnecting with the son of his good friend Jonathan. I think that's just a summary of what's in this chapter. David reconnecting with the son of his good friend Jonathan. And so as we get started, I guess I would want to ask whether any of us here this morning have ever had the opportunity to end up being friends with your best friend's children. That's kind of a strange connection there, but if you've had a chance to be friends with your best friend's children, or have any of us had the opportunity to reconnect with somebody, hopefully in a good way, I don't want to cause mental grief on us this morning, but have we had the opportunity to reconnect with somebody in a good way from our distant past? So be thinking of that if you have examples. Personally, I have thought that it's been really cool to hear from my daughter about some of her friends down at Freed-Hardeman University in Tennessee, and she'll mention something and we'll think that name sounds familiar, and it ends up her connecting with kids of our friends from 20, 30 years ago, which I always think is just interesting. And you got that connection, though. So that's kind of that friend connection over a generation or two. And then in terms of connecting with somebody from the distant past, kind of in an unusual way, I just want to share about what happened back in Alaska when we traveled there a few years back. And some of you know we were traveling in the middle of nowhere, and I think we were in Anchorage. We had gone down to Soldotna. One of my dad's aunts is buried there, so we were coming back from Soldotna. And on our way back to Anchorage, deserted road, middle of nowhere, no cell service at all, there is a traffic jam. So what in the world is going on? Traffic was backed up for several miles, and I was in one car with my dad, and Keola was in another car about half mile up with my mom. And miles up ahead, a Pepsi truck had actually gone off the road, and it had kind of jackknifed and gone off in a ditch. It was blocking both lanes of traffic. So again, middle of nowhere, we were just parked there for a couple hours. And my dad and I got out of the car to stretch a little bit, and the older man and woman in the car right ahead of us, coming out of a truck, they also got out of their truck, and we start talking. And my dad asked this older man, so what do you do for a living? And this older man says, I'm a gospel preacher. And my dad and I looked at each other, and nobody says that but us. That's an interesting way of saying, I am a gospel preacher. So I'm a gospel preacher. And so we ask for the churches of Christ. And the man says, yes. And we start to say, well, so are we. And then you start talking to people, and you try to come up with mutual connections. And suddenly the man says, I think I know you. My name is Dave Dvorak. Well, Keola's parents, they first found out about the Lord's Church out in La Junta, Colorado through a fellow airman in the Air Force, had invited my future father-in-law and his family to a vacation Bible school. They obeyed the gospel there. Then they moved to Alaska, where Dave Dvorak was their preacher for a number of years. And so we had some two-way radios in the car since the cells weren't working. And so I radioed to Keola up ahead, you will never guess who I'm with. I'm standing in the middle of the highway with Dave and Marilyn Dvorak. And so Dave was serving as the preacher and as one of the elders in Homer, Alaska up there, and he just happened to be stuck in that same traffic jam that day right in front of us. And so I gave the radio to Marilyn, and then she walked toward Keola. Keola walked back, and they met in the middle, and then they came back and talked to us for a little while. And Dave's number one concern was for Keola and her family. How is everybody doing spiritually? And I just thought that was interesting coming from a shepherd in the Lord's church. That was his number one thing. And just an amazing reunion, standing out there in the middle of the road, and that was a highlight of our trip. But does anybody else have an example of connecting with somebody from the past like that or anything? Yeah.
A lot of my friends, like when I was in like at a different school, but I got in trouble and moved, and then I forgot a couple of examples. My friend, I was had him on Facebook. I was like, hey, it's Trevi, do you remember I went to DC, right? He's like, yeah, you're my homie or whatever, you're my friend or whatever. And
Okay.
and then my other friend, we were friends until towards the end of it, because we were fighting off and on.
Okay.
And then towards the end of right before I left, we were friends.
Interesting.
And then before I left, we got in a fight, and then now we're just best friends.
Interesting. So switching schools, and then you reconnect with somebody that you knew from a previous school. Okay. Anything else before we move on? Right. So it happens, doesn't it? We reconnect with somebody from the past, and you mentioned Facebook. That's been a value of that. People we hadn't thought about for 30 years, and then we have mutual friends, and we make that connection and move forward from there. So in 2 Samuel chapter 9, we're going to look at an example of King David reconnecting with the son of his best friend after a number of years. So I think it's hard to nail down the timeline. Probably 15 to 20 years or so is about what goes by. Before we get to the text, I think we kind of need to span the gap between where we were last week and where we are this morning. We're jumping around. Let's fill that in just a little bit. Last week we looked at the account of Uzzah, if you remember. 2 Samuel chapter 6, David has just conquered Jerusalem. He's making Jerusalem his new capital, and in the process, he moves the ark, or at least he tries. In the process, Uzzah dies. They try it again, doing it God's way. A few months later, everything goes well the second time. So that's in 2 Samuel 6. That's what we studied last week. In 2 Samuel 7, David realizes that he's living in this fancy new house built out of cedar, but the ark of God that he just moved to Jerusalem is still in a tent. And so David basically says, God, I want to build you a permanent structure. We need to get the ark out of this tent and into an actual building. And God's answer is basically, no, not quite yet. First of all, God says, I never asked for a temple. I'm fine with the tent. This is the way I intended it from the beginning. This is 2 Samuel 7, 1 through 17. But then secondly, David points out later he also wasn't allowed to build the temple himself. Do you remember why? He was a man of war. He had shed too much blood. And that reference is in 1 Chronicles 28, 1, 2, and 3. So God wanted his temple not to be built by a warrior, but by a man of peace. He didn't want it to be seen as like a conquest. And so not you, but the good news is God tells David that he wants David's son to build it. So not you, but your son. So What I find interesting is David does not seem to be really disappointed by that, but he takes it as good news. So why was David excited to hear that his son would build the temple? Why would a king be so excited to hear that his son will do something big in the future? Yeah.
Because of the honor of the son, like his son, like if it's his own, like he'd probably be proud of his son.
Yeah, so it's in the family. So it'll be a great honor for his son. And maybe even before that, I'll have a son, right? Just kings in that time were often killed, and it was a quick turnover, like in the nations of the world. So just to know that I'm going to have a son, that he will survive me, and that my kingdom will live on after me would certainly be good news. Did you have...
That his son would take over the kingdom, because
Yes.
he had taken it over from Saul, and he was not Saul's son.
Yes, good point. Okay, so King David took it over from Saul, not being Saul's son. So he's probably thinking in the future, there's a good chance somebody other than my family will take over this kingdom. So when God says your son will build the temple, David's thinking, okay, we're good. This is good news. Even though I can't do it, my family will live on. This will be something of a legacy, and this will continue. Okay, so instead of building the temple himself, what does David do instead? He can't build the temple himself. What does he do to help out?
He starts to gather all the things that are needed, because it's going to take a lot of supplies to do this job. So he starts putting it together.
Yeah, so even though he can't do the actual construction, his role is to gather all the materials and to get it all ready for his son to just put it into place. So David's doing everything he can to assemble the resources, and that's what we see in 2 Samuel 8. In 2 Samuel 8, David kills and conquers. That's the way I've summarized it on the wall up here. He defeats pretty much everybody. He defeats the Philistines. Remember Goliath and the Philistines? He wipes them out. He defeats them, subdues them in the first few verses. He defeats the Moabites. He defeats all these surrounding nations. There's like a list of nations that he overcomes. And as he does this, he takes all of their gold and their precious metals, and he brings all of that stuff back to Jerusalem for the temple. At the end of 2 Samuel 8, in verse 15, the text says, "So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and righteousness for all his people." So that's kind of a summary of David's kind of the first half of his reign. So things are going really well. Very well for King David at this point. He's winning. He's bringing back literally tons of gold, silver, other supplies, precious metals, stones. And I find it interesting. He's placing these items not in his own treasury, but he's dedicating these items to the Lord. So that this gold and all that's coming back, he's giving to the priests, and then they catalog it and they stockpile all of this. So he's collecting supplies and building materials for the future construction of the temple. So in the middle of all of this prosperity, all of this military success, he's conquering everybody in the area. That's where we come to 2 Samuel chapter 9. So let's start with 2 Samuel 9, and let's look at the first 5 verses. 2 Samuel 9, verses 1 through 5. Then David said, "Is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David, and the king said to him, 'Are you Ziba?' And he answered and said, he said, 'I am your servant.' The king said, 'Is there not yet anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?' And Ziba said to the king, 'There is still a son of Jonathan who is crippled in both feet.' So the king said to him, 'Where is he?' And Ziba said to the king, 'Behold, he is in the house of Machir the son of Ammiel in Lodebar.' Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir the son of Ammiel from Lodebar." So if you notice at the beginning of chapter 9, just kind of out of the blue, David thinks of Jonathan. And I know we just looked at David and Jonathan a few weeks ago, but it may be good to Jude kind of bring us up to speed and do a brief review. Jonathan was the son of King Saul. Saul had disobeyed God in the matter of the Amalekites, not killing them all when he was told to kill them all. So Saul is on his way out. He's displeasing to God. He's disobedient. As God is in the process of preparing future King David, we have several years of tension between David and Saul. I think that would be putting it mildly. So David kills Goliath. David gets all the praise. And Saul starts getting jealous. Saul is literally losing his mind. and he's chasing David all over the place trying to kill him. And somewhere in that process, David and Jonathan, the son of King Saul, they become the best of friends. So they are very close to one another. And we see this back in 1 Samuel 20, verses 12 through 17. So I'll just read this from the previous book, 1 Samuel 20, 12 through 17. After Jonathan helps David escape, saving his life, this is what Jonathan says. And may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord that I may not die? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies. Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. So I just hope we notice there that David makes a promise. Basically, Jonathan makes David make a promise, and that I will never destroy Jonathan's descendants. Does that make sense? Like, be nice to my family. I think Jonathan can see where this is going. David is on his way up. Saul is on his way out. And so kind of the last minute thing here, Jonathan says to David, you got to promise me something, that you'll be kind to my family, to anybody who survives me. And David agrees to this because of his great love for Jonathan. I would also point out that Jonathan very specifically makes David promise that he will remember his descendants. So not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And to me, that brings us back to 2 Samuel chapter 9. In chapter 8, David kills pretty much everybody. He dominates all the surrounding nations. He builds garrisons or forts on the outer boundaries of the nation, so everything's under control, everything's going well. And so as I see this, David finally has a chance to relax one night. He's been out dominating everybody in the area. He finally gets back to Jerusalem, sits down, and in my opinion, David realizes that Jonathan could see this day coming. So from 15, 20 years back, Jonathan knew there was a time coming when David would dominate, and in that day he made David promise, do not forget my family, and don't destroy us along with everybody else. So back in 2 Samuel 9, this is back where we started this morning, David starts asking, is there anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? So David has people who take care of this, people in his court. They find Ziba, Saul's servant. They bring Ziba into the throne room. So I'm thinking like a formal, hey, here he is, presented to the king, and David wants to know, are you Ziba? So what do you think is going through Ziba's mind at this moment?
He's been Saul's servant, he may be a danger.
Yeah, he's been Saul's servant. A number of years have gone by, and now this new king who's killing people left and right brings you in and says, are you Ziba? And, I'm thinking, oh no, I'm a dead man. Well, it depends. Why do you want me kind of thing. But Ziba, though, he answers, I am your servant. Pretty good answer, isn't it? I mean, if you're in that situation, I'm serving you now. I'm not serving Saul. I am your servant. So good answer given. So David now, he wants to know if anybody's left so he can show the kindness of God toward them. And David uses a word here that is sometimes translated as loving kindness or steadfast love. And if you look in a footnote, it may have it there. But this is a common word in the Old Testament describing the love of God for his people. So like steadfast, loyal, covenant love. I'll do whatever it takes, whatever you need to have done, I'll do it kind of love. And so David wants to take God's love that's been shown toward him, and he wants to pass it on to the descendants of Jonathan here. Wants to demonstrate this to a descendant of Saul for Jonathan's sake, I guess we should say. And I think personally, if I'm Ziba here, I may be a little bit skeptical. I think maybe hoping for the best, but is he using me to kill off any remainder? I don't know, but Ziba points them to a son of Jonathan. He points out the son is crippled in both feet. So now that we have this reference to being crippled in both feet, I kind of want us to back up again, and we have this passing reference back in 2 Samuel 4:4. Now Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the report of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. And his nurse took him up and fled. And it happened that in her hurry to flee, he fell and became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth. So here we got a kid, 5 years old, basically, I would say, in the care of a nanny. It's kind of the way we would say it today. She was responsible for him as a 5-year-old. When she hears that Saul and Jonathan are dead. So if you're a nanny taking care of the king's grandson, when the king and the king's son, the boy's father, are apparently killed in battle, what might you assume? The kid is next. And not only is the kid next, it's not looking good for you either. I mean, that's just kind of the way things go. So we're dead, and they're coming for us next. So they run. And as soon as they hear that Saul and Jonathan are dead, they run. And as they run, something happens. Something goes wrong. The kid falls. Some have speculated maybe like she fell on him, or he fell, there was some accident, there's a fall, something happens to both of his feet. And so they're on the run. She obviously can't set the bones properly. There's no medical care. They're in the middle of nowhere. And so they live for years in the wilderness, and he grows up completely unable to walk. He's lame in the feet. So something grew back wrong when those bones healed. And so this is where we learn that his name is Mephibosheth. So back in 2 Samuel 9, back to our original assigned passage, David finds out from Ziba that Mephibosheth is living with some guy out in Lo-debar. And Lo-debar is a name meaning no pasture. Okay, so no pasture. So what do you think that describes? Yeah, no man's land. So wilderness, mountains, it's not a friendly place to live. This is a good place to hide. So if you're the grandson of a dead king and the new king is killing everybody in sight, your mission in life is to disappear and keep a low profile. So Mephibosheth seems to be hiding. David, though, sends for Mephibosheth and has him brought in just as Ziba was brought in. Okay, now if you're Mephibosheth at this point and soldiers show up to bring you to the new king, what are you thinking?
Oh, good.
I'm dead. Kind of like Ziba, right? The same thing. This is not good. First of all, how did they find me? You got representatives of the king. They just showed up in Lo-debar in the middle of nowhere. And so this is it. He's going to whack me. When we studied this back in 2015, I put a note in the margin of my class notes for if I ever taught this chapter again. When I asked, what is Mephibosheth thinking? Aaron Grodi says he was thinking, I wish I could run. I wish my feet worked. That's a very good answer. And so Mephibosheth is at a serious disadvantage here. He has feet that don't work, and the king's representatives have showed up out front to say, hey, come with us. Okay, so let's look at what happens next. So let's pick up with 2 Samuel 9, verses 6 through 8. 2 Samuel 9, 6 through 8. Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he said, here is your servant. David said to him, do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table regularly. Again he prostrated himself and said, what is your servant, that you should regard a dead dog like me? Well, when Mephibosheth is brought in, what is his demeanor? What is his attitude here? How does he present himself? As a servant, falls down right on his face. He's practically worshiping David. He's showing the utmost of honor there on his face to the ground. David calls him by name, puts him at ease, don't fear. And again, we've said often in the Bible, when somebody is told not to fear, there's a good chance they're afraid. They need to be told that. So I think David, as a wise man, can see it. So don't fear. I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan. Okay, there are two parts of this kindness, as I understand it. What is the first awesome news? What's the first part of this? What's David going to do? Yeah.
Pretty much welcome him, not kill him.
Yeah, well, I guess very first of all, I won't kill you like you think I'm going to do, okay? What about that's a good answer. So what about the reward? What else is he going to do?
His grandfather.
The land. Okay, so I will give you all the land that Saul once owned. You think Saul owned some land as the king of Israel? I'm thinking that's kind of a significant thing. What would that mean for Mephibosheth to be given acres and acres and acres of land? What would that mean for his life? How would that impact him personally? What is that, Patsy?
He'd be taken care of.
He'd be taken care of.
Yeah.
So I'm no longer hiding in some cave in Lodabar. I now have a place. So what's the other benefit of having land? I guess you kind of covered it. Yeah.
King.
Well, he wouldn't be a king, but in a sense he would live like a king, wouldn't he? He would have the benefits as if he were a king in that he would have a serious amount of land. So no more living in the wilderness, no more living in poverty. I mean, land ownership was huge in the ancient world. If you owned land, you were kind of taken care of. So he could live securely, provide for his own needs. So this is a huge blessing. What is the second big part of this kindness that David plans to show? Not only will he give him all of Saul's land, but what else will he do?
He'd be
Invited to dinner.
He will be invited to dinner. And not just once, right? He will have a permanent place at the king's table. So, I mean, there will be a card on the table that says Mephibosheth, right? That will be this is your spot from here on to the rest of your life. You now have a place at the king's table. So that, I mean, is just an amazing privilege, huge, we can hardly imagine. And how does Mephibosheth respond to this? What is his answer? What is his response to King David?
What are you doing this for me?
Yes. Why? So he's been hiding for all these years, terrified that somebody's going to find him. Now he gets found, and it's totally the opposite of what he imagined. And so his question is, what is your servant that you should regard a dead dog like me? And this may be a weird question, but do you have any idea where Mephibosheth might have got the idea of referring to himself as a dead dog? Where have we heard that before?
I guess they said that dogs were not thought of very well in that country, and anything dead was not thought of.
Okay, so from a
Well,
practical definition of the word kind of thing, dogs were not respected like they are in our culture, and so it was a dead dog was like less than nothing. That phrase, though, is used before. In 1 Samuel 24:14, when Saul was chasing King David, David confronted Saul and said, "After whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom are you pursuing? A dead dog? A single flea?" So I don't know whether Mephibosheth was even alive to hear that, but I would not be surprised if he had heard it at least secondhand, if not firsthand, that David had confronted his grandfather and had referred to himself as a dead dog. So that was David calling himself that. And so as I read this passage, connecting it back with 1 Samuel 24:14, I'm thinking Mephibosheth then may be reminding David, both of us at one time had achieved dead dog status. Does that make sense to you? We don't have that nailed down for sure, but that connection, it's just interesting that same phrase was used by David regarding himself, and now it's used by Mephibosheth referring to himself. Like, why have you done this amazing thing for me? So I just wanted to point that out before we go any further. Okay, let's look at the last paragraph here. So this is 2 Samuel 9, verses 9 through 11. 2 Samuel 9, 9 through 11. Then the king called Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring in the produce so that your master's grandson may have food. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate at the king's table regularly. Now he was lame in both feet. So what role does David give to Ziba here? Yeah, to look after Mephibosheth, and even beyond that, to manage the land, right? So, Mephibosheth can't literally get out in the fields and plow and that kind of thing. So David assigns Ziba this protector status over Mephibosheth is kind of the way I would understand it. So the manager of King Saul's property that has been given to Mephibosheth, and Ziba is now responsible for cultivating the land, making sure that Mephibosheth is all squared away. And again, thinking about this from Ziba's point of view, this could have ended very differently from the way that it did. I think that's an accurate thing to say. So he went from terror, probably being approached by the king's soldiers or whatever, to now that, wow, I am set for life. And I've been set up as manager of probably a rather sizable piece of land. At the end of verse 10, we find Ziba had quite the family of his own. In verse 11, he accepts the new responsibility. In the last part of 11, we find that Mephibosheth eats at King David's table just as one of the king's sons. So as I would see this, he's basically adopted into the family. You are now one of us. You have a place at our table. You're a part of our family. In verse 12, we find Mephibosheth has a young son named Micah, and they all live happily ever after. That's kind of basically the way this chapter ends. He lives in Jerusalem, and he eats at the king's table regularly. And then the little reminder here at the end that Mephibosheth was lame in both feet, and that ties in with that passage that we read earlier. All right, so we've looked at 2 Samuel chapter 9, and let's make a few kind of applications combined with some observations looking back over this. And first of all, we have a lesson on faithful love. Remember that word I was pointing out? Covenant love. Promise-keeping kind of love. So when David goes looking to do something for a descendant of Saul, I would just point out here that had everything to do with David and almost nothing to do with Saul's descendants. It wasn't because they deserved it. They weren't out there waiting in a cave, waiting for their time to come when somebody would finally recognize them for how awesome they were. That's not what was going on. Mephibosheth had done nothing to deserve it. He accepted David's kindness. He responded with respect and humility, but he really did nothing to deserve it. And I would just ask whether we see how this parallels between what God has done for us. Do we see that connection? He has shown us faithful love, not because we deserve it, but because he has made promises. We accept his love, we accept it on his terms, and we obey, but there's nothing we do to deserve it. So God made the first move, and we respond to that. How do you think David would have responded if Mephibosheth had come in there and had the attitude, you can't tell me what to do, kind of thing? I mean, that's just a thought question. We don't know, but yeah.
He probably would have rethink of what he promised to Jonathan.
I mean, I'd be rethinking it. I mean, if somebody won't accept the gift that you're giving, what other option do you have? You can't force somebody to accept some gracious gift. So I would agree. If it were me, I would kind of, well, what can I do if he has a bad attitude about it? I was thinking of a story from a number of years back where an entire police force was mobilized to find a man who had stolen, it was an old beat-up Volkswagen, and they put out word over the radio. They did everything they could possibly do to find the man because the owner of the car informed the authorities that there was a box of crackers on the front seat that he had laced with poison to kill some critters in his house. And the car was stolen before he could get home to deploy the poison for the rats or whatever it was. And so the police, they were out there looking desperately for the car, not to put the man in jail, but to save his life. Does that kind of make sense? So we got to find this guy, even though he's a bad guy. He doesn't deserve being saved, but it's our job to save him. And maybe a parallel here, and a parallel between what the Lord has done for us. He came to this earth to seek and to save that which was lost. We don't deserve it. He still tries. And he tries and he tries and he tries for as long as we live. That offer is still open. So kind of in the same way, when David went looking for Saul's descendants, he wasn't looking to punish them, not to wipe them off the face of the earth, but for the purpose of showing them kindness. So that's kind of the first overarching lesson here about the faithful love of God. And then secondly, if we could think about this now from Mephibosheth's point of view. So here he is, 5 years old, when he learns that his grandfather, the king, has died. His dad has died. almost immediately on the run, he falls and apparently breaks both feet, making him lame for the rest of his life, ending up on the run for the rest of his life. And that's a lot to take in for anybody, let alone a 5-year-old. But in a sense, we are Mephibosheth in that picture. So we're the ones who are lost, we're messed up, but God is out there looking for us. So if we could see ourselves as Mephibosheth in this story or this account here. And I guess tied to that, something of a thought question. As Mephibosheth eats at the king's table, as he shares a table with men like Absalom and eventually Solomon, I mean, imagine who's around this table. These are powerful people in the nation. As Mephibosheth is at the king's table for the rest of his life, do you think he complained about the food? We're not told, are we? But, I mean, in my mind, if we get thrown into that situation, oh, David, you're not serving that again. It just doesn't make sense, does it? So just the appreciation and the lack of whining that I would hope would be absent in this situation. And I guess another thought question, as David eats dinner and looks across the table for the next 20 whatever years, do you think David ever thinks about Jonathan? You know how fathers and sons have a way of looking like each other? You think David comes home from a battle and sits down at dinner and he sees this guy, and he probably looks just like his good friend. Probably the way his good friend looked 20 years ago. So the way he remembers Jonathan, Mephibosheth is now growing up in the image of his father. So I think, in my opinion, he'd be able to see that family resemblance and would be able to think of Jonathan's kindness and what Jonathan had done for him, and then the kindness of God that he was considered a dead dog just as Mephibosheth was. And then also from Mephibosheth's point of view, what do you think he thought of as he sat across from King David for the rest of his life? As he pulls up the chair to dinner, what do you think Mephibosheth is thinking?
Friendship with his father and David.
Okay. Remembering the friendship between his father and King David? I would agree. And even beyond that, just
Grateful.
wow, yeah. This is absolutely amazing. I pinch myself. I can't believe I'm actually here in this room. You know, gold goblets, the finest of everything. I'm sitting across from the king and his family and military leaders, and I've done nothing to deserve this. So
Did he actually know David though? I mean, if he was running at 5 years
I don't think so. I mean, they might have met, but even then we have no record of that. Yeah, no record of that at all. So the question is, did Mephibosheth know David? Yeah, I would think like the average 5-year-old may not have an appreciation for meeting the king. But not that it's outside the realm of possibility without looking more into the timeline, but that's a good question. But just the amazing blessing that David didn't kill him and that he's done this amazing thing for him. So like amazing grace, as we would sing today. And yeah.
I was thinking about his invitation to join the king at the table. We have the same invitation.
Yes.
But we have to be there.
Okay. So the point is that we've also been invited to the king's table, haven't we? In a symbolic sense, in that we're invited into the family. But there's another table that we've been invited to, isn't there? I mean, every Lord's Day morning, we, in a sense, gather around the table. We don't gather around the table. We share the bread and the fruit of the vine as a group. But it is referred to, I believe, as the Lord's table, the table of the Lord. So like Mephibosheth, we've been invited into a place where we really don't deserve to be. But we are overwhelmed with gratefulness. Any final comments on this chapter before we close today? Yeah, Patsy?
I was just thinking when you were talking about it, it wasn't time for him to build the temple yet. You know?
Okay.
All through the Bible it talks about it wasn't time yet.
Oh,
you know.
Okay.
And I mean, Jesus was, you know, he escaped several times because it wasn't his time yet.
Okay.
And Paul, you know, it wasn't his time yet. And
Okay.
so I'm sure there's other incidents. Well, like with Abraham, when God gave him the promise, he didn't have a son either.
Right.
And you know, so.
So just a thought on God's timing on things. So the comment
God has
is,
a plan, you know. and
okay,
So.
God has a plan, and we may not always be in on the details.
Mhm.
But our
Yeah.
mission is to trust and obey, for there's no other way. We just do what God's told us to do, and we try to be patient. Good point. All right, well, let's dismiss here, and then we'll get back together for the second service at 11. Glad you guys were here safely.